Sanctuary has been weakened. The Crimson Raiders are in tatters, and Pandora is in chaos. The Vault Key, which promised power and therefore stability, has been lost, taken by roving bandits. In response, Commander Lilith, the new leader of the Crimson Raiders, sends out 4 Vault Hunters to retrieve it. Though it's high stakes, the job itself is not terribly difficult. Lilith simply does not have the people to spare to do it. The mission is a success. The 4 Vault Hunters are able to infiltrate the camp, steal the key, and escape using a bandit technical. Almost too easy. Nevertheless, now is not the time to look a gift horse in the mouth. Lilith tells the 4 Vault Hunters to rendezvous with her at Sanctuary 3, both the last stronghold of the Raiders and their means of accessing the vaults. Lilith congratulates the Vault Hunters and begins to charge the artifact, but nothing happens. Suddenly alarms blare, and Ellie reports that they're being attacked by bandits. Lilith leads the charge with the Vault Hunters outside to confront the foe. The fight goes on for a while, and she's killing bandits by the score. Eventually, however, Lilith is overwhelmed, and, walking backwards, doesn't notice somebody grab at her from the shadows. Suddenly she's lifted over the air, and her tattoos cease to glow. This is the leader of the bandits, Tyreen Calypso. Lilith is thrown to the ground, her eyes burned out husks. Ellie is panicking, screaming into the echo. She tells the Vault Hunter to hold on for a little bit longer, but suddenly, the Bandit Queen starts teleporting around. Teleportation is clumsy, but it's effective. She's getting closer, much faster. Suddenly, Ellie yells that they're all ready to go, and the ship departs, with you still fighting on the bridge. Ellie, distraught, tries to get everything in order as best she can. As she's perusing the old Catch-A-Ride system, she notices that the bandit technical that the group had taken back to Sanctuary was bugged. Someone was tracking them, and that someone was Tyreen Calypso, hungry for Lilith's power. Tanis, managing to stay level-headed in this chaos, remarks grimly that with Lilith's power, Tyreen is fully capable of charging the Vault Key that she just stole back. The Raiders are in the worst state that they've ever been in, and, rudderless, left only with the promise that if they let the Vault Key stay in the hands of the Calypsos, then both Lilith and Roland will have died for nothing, and Pandora will remain a lawless hellhole forever. This is not what happens in Borderlands 3. I made this up. Sorry. Part 1. Why bother? Instead, the player is recruited to the Raiders, instructed to find the Vault Key, which they do, immediately meet the COV and the Calypsos, and prepare to board Sanctuary 3 to go to the location of the first vault. Then the game starts a cutscene. Tyreen and Troy randomly approach Lilith from either side. Lilith, a woman perfectly capable of teleporting at any moment, stands there like a deer in the headlights with her hands on an artifact that the Calypsos want. Now, after a slow and clumsy battle, Lilith is ultimately grabbed by Tyreen. Tyreen, suspending Lilith, then begins to relentlessly spout information. Troy is her brother. They're both sirens. They were conjoined twins. She's draining Lilith. She's taking her powers. Each of these things conveyed by the same charisma as reading off lecture notes. Then she literally turns to an in-universe camera and says that she's headed to Promethea, that she stole Lilith's powers, and then leaves to go do that. The point I'm trying to make is that there's no reason that this introduction to the villains, the setup of the plot, and this framing device all had to be handled so poorly. All of the pieces were there.
You're crying from got to me.
Having Tyreen hold Lilith suspended in the air and explain the premise of the villains for nearly a full minute is completely avoidable. But that's not the Borderlands 3 that we got. I think that the reason that I was curious enough to think of some way that this could have gone differently or even been handled competently was that it was never a guarantee that Borderlands 3 would fall so flatly on its face. In the end, it did. And with Borderlands 4 on the horizon and the franchise lifting its boot out of yet another cow pie in the Borderlands movie, I think it might be worth asking, why is Borderlands 3 a near miss? Is Borderlands 3 even a near miss? True confession, I am a Borderlands fan. Well, I liked Borderlands 2. I find it difficult in good conscience to completely recommend the Borderlands franchise, considering that I would currently tally it in as having 1, maybe 1.5 good pieces of media to its name. But if you're like me and you have a high tolerance for pop culture references and Whedon-esque quippy dialogue, then you will probably have a good time. As far as I'm concerned, the looter-shooter genre is still the house that Borderlands built. So, one would hope that the poster child for the looter-shooter genre would have more to offer than what we got with Borderlands 3. And having gone through and done a full autopsy, I would say that there were things worth saving. A good Borderlands game isn't just a Skinner box, it's an addictive shoot-and-loot gameplay loop overlaid on a story that pushes you with constant action through fun characters and interesting arenas. When people talk about this franchise, and specifically this entry in the franchise, there are some frequent recurring complaints that I would call not terribly productive. While definitely fair points, a lot of these critiques would not have sunk this game if it was otherwise of good quality. Before we proceed into this critique, I think that I should address them in order. Pop culture references. If the franchise was going to stop doing them, then I think that they would have done it by now. And to be fair, even the best games and the best characters suffer from these moments.
Double rainbow all the way.
So, enduring a few cringy, dated references is, at this point, just part of the buy-in, like hanging out with your dad. Toilet humor? We know. We know about that quest and that rocket launcher, we know about the multiple toilet-based threats that occur throughout the game. It's not funny. And if Gearbox hasn't figured out that it's not funny by now, I would be very surprised. If the main boss in Borderlands 4 threatens to make doo-doo on you, then I guess I'll retract my claim and call this a fair point. The main villains being streamers. The game barely acknowledges it past a few routine nods in the first area, and unsurprisingly, it's much better for that. Obviously, it would have been better to have not done it at all, but we can't get the toothpaste back in the tube. Just because something has a relatively unserious premise doesn't mean that it couldn't have been executed better. We'll get to that. Though if the next Borderlands villain is an OnlyFans model, then I guess I'll retract this point as well. Ava. She's not that bad. Yes, she did get Maya killed, but she's also a teenager. And she's written like a teenager pretty convincingly, with all the annoyance of teenagers that comes with. Would it have been better to not have an actual child in the game? Yeah, well, that's not for me to say. Again, we should focus more on execution than underlying premise. And say what you will about her, but she does answer the prompt well. She's far from the least consistent character in this game. If all of these largely aesthetic issues had been scrubbed away from Borderlands 3, then it would be a bland game. As it stands, the only way that I've been able to convince people to spend time on this game is either to dissect it like roadkill or to gawk at it like a wrecked out Miata on I-29. And I can't help but feel it could have been more. That there is something here, something that hasn't been capitalized on correctly. I don't know exactly the reason that hasn't been capitalized on correctly. Maybe they ran out of money, maybe they ran out of time, maybe their eyes were bigger than their stomach. Be that as it may, the game still fundamentally lacks something that it previously had. And while it's difficult to nail down the precise issue, it's not difficult to nail down a comparison. Part 2. Legacy. It's inevitable that to talk about Borderlands 3, we're going to have to talk about Borderlands 2. And if I avoided talking about Borderlands 2, I don't think that I could cover much of 3. Borderlands 3 clearly wants to stand on the shoulders of its predecessor, and in its wholly original sections, it occasionally does well, but when it tries to imitate its predecessor, it almost always falls on its face. The main villains clearly want the unrepentant swagger that Handsome Jack had in the first game. Tyreen especially feels like a reheated Handsome Jack impression. But they universally fail to land his charisma and his aloof charm.
Get your butt shined by our expert butt ballet.
I mean, that's a butt shit.
Every time that Tyreen calls you a whippy name or tries to taunt you with the amount of power she has in comparison to you, it falls flat, and it makes you hate her like you hate a housefly, not an adversary. Handsome Jack was lightning in a bottle. I don't think that they'll ever be able to replicate a villain who was as active and as hateable, but also as charming as him. The closest that I think even qualifies is Pagan Min from Far Cry 4. Tyreen's power completely dwarfs Handsome Jack's peak at around the midpoint of the game. She's a planet-hopping monstrosity who can teleport things seemingly intergalactically, and has a non-stop urge for even more power on top of this. It seems that the only thing she wants to do with power is use it to gain more attention. Previous Borderlands villains have wanted to use the power of the Volts to change the world significantly. Tyreen just wants it to make more people look at her? Could she not just rent a billboard? While the Calypso twins are indeed twins, in the actual story of the game you will see far more of Tyreen than you do Troy. It's unfortunate because they do seem to be setting something up with Troy in the Eden 6 chapter, but they never seem to really capitalize it except for in the sequence when he drains Tyreen in order to open the vault. The sequence is interesting, but it's hardly the encapsulation of the arc that they were seemingly foreshadowing with Troy's gestures towards rebellion. Ultimately, Troy fails to register in the broader scope of the story. Tyreen's reheated Handsome Jack status is underscored in the moments when the game tries to reprint the death of Roland. Maya's death, being at the hands of the main villain and caused inadvertently by the intrusion of a headstrong siren, is not as impactful as Roland's. The longer, drawn-out cutscenes that the game goes for fail to capture the impact that Roland's death has. When Roland dies, it's sudden, it's horrible, blood sprays on your face. You barely have time to react before you're thrown back into gameplay. Maya's death is predictable, slow, drawn out, and gives you far too much time to process it for it to be effective. While Maya's death didn't need to be sudden and jarring necessarily, the fact that she turns into a book makes it sort of hard to take her death completely seriously. This isn't helped very much by the fact that Maya doesn't really have much presence in the story. If you don't know her from Borderlands 2, she'll be dead 3 missions after you meet her for the first time. If you do know her from Borderlands 2, then you know her from the quip she makes when she scores headshot damage, which isn't a fantastic avenue to explore her character. This wouldn't be that much of an issue if there were, again, more than 3 missions with Maya in them, but there are not. She's thrown out in 3 missions like weak old coleslaw. Maya's not the only character to rely on a grandfathered-in sense of story importance. Almost all of the characters you'll find on Sanctuary 3 are returning from previous games. However, most of these characters have returned heavily flanderized. 2 of them, however, return unscathed, and even somewhat improved. Part 3. Characters. Ellie stands out as the most improved of all the characters. In Borderlands 2, she was a fun character, but she was marred by relentless jabs at her weight, and there was a slight assumption that the mere presence of an overweight woman was somehow inherently funny. In 3, not only is she unashamed of how her body looks, but she's somewhat proud. She's flirty, rough and tumble, and a strong presence of uncomplicated positivity aboard the ship. No notes for Ellie. She's great. As well, Hammerlock is largely unchanged from Borderlands 2, continuing to boast his rakish charm and natural zeal for life on hostile alien planets. Now, however, he also has another adventuring-type character to bounce off of in the form of Wainwright Jacobs, his lover, and in many ways his foil. His interactions with Wainwright and with the player in general give him very real stakes in the story of the game, and give him an infectious charm. Hammerlock and Ellie are marginally improved in the story and stand out in the cast as returning faces that feel both friendly and familiar. The rest cannot be said for the other returning cast. Tannis is a character that never should have attained the amount of plot relevance that she has in this game. It's unfortunate because in small doses her character is kind of fun, but forcing her to be in situations where she absolutely doesn't belong and would never place herself means that her character is strained at the best of times. Tannis' somewhat detached and borderline psychopathic personality was, in past games, fun and quirky. In this game, where she's forced to stand in the spotlight for far too long, her position as the Iridian researcher means that she will frequently pull plot devices out of thin air. Nowhere does this feel more Deus Ex Machina than when she turns into a siren. While it is technically foreshadowed, Tannis' largest story beat, turning into a siren, is completely impossible for the player to predict. The game changes a lot of the very simple rules surrounding sirens from the previous installments, and this is mostly to its detriment because the player is constantly being jumped with new rules that they didn't know were actually rules. It appears to be in the game that you can kind of loot siren powers off of the dead. This makes Ava's presence in the story make more sense, and makes Maya's talk of how she's training her a little bit more sensical. But for all the things the game over-explains, it really doesn't explain this change until it's already happened. If Tannis and Angel had any interaction, I did not know about it. Despite this, somehow Angel's powers have transferred to Tannis. I'm certain that there's an explanation for this that's probably on an audio log or wiki post, but I did not care to go find it, and I think that playing the plain text of the game should be enough to explain this. Vaughn and Reese, both returning characters from the Tales from the Borderlands game, have lost anything unessential to their new archetype. Namely, they've lost their wit, charm, and anything that got in the way of them being outright jokes. Vaughn's entire character is largely reduced to saying the word bro and being in underpants. As for Reese, there's just no getting around that Reese is a CEO. And especially a CEO in a franchise that generally finds that synonymous with villainy. The only real exception is Wainwright Jacobs, who has a CEO position thrust upon him. Reese does not have this distinction. He fought hard for his CEO position, and now that he has it, he's very difficult to empathize with. The game settles on making an even larger CEO and reducing Reese to a series of jokes about frozen yogurt and how he has a mustache.
Am I pulling off this mustache or what?
Buddy! Separated from these jokes, the entire section playing alongside Reese would simply be defending a multi-million-dollar corporation from another multi-million-dollar corporation. And if you want that, you can just go to law school. The Tales cast has been hollowed out to the point where it would make more sense if they had been different characters entirely. Barely anything is done with Moxie, and that's not atypical, but she warrants special mention due to her being possibly the most rotted out character in the game. Her side quest, should you choose to accept it, revolves around hunting down her ex-boyfriend who had the gall to open his own fighting arena and be a little bit awkward. Moxie eggs you on throughout this entire quest, and what could have been gentle mocking turns into outright cruelty against her ex, who, after you murder, she takes a trophy of his remains and displays it over a toilet. Moxie's continued presence in this game, only to be part of this horrible side quest, calls her entire presence into question. As it stands, she exists solely so the player has a place to gamble while the main characters talk in the cockpit. Even Moxie, however, does not take the crown for most worsened. That title goes to the funny little robot. Claptrap has gone from in-universe annoying and tolerable in actual play to intolerable and ever-present in both. His shtick from 2 of treating you like an underling was always underpinned by a comeuppance. But now Claptrap continues to be a horrible little moron that gets on your nerves while also completely getting away with it at every turn. Claptrap's presence in dialogue, which is very large, is exclusively a pain point. He adds nothing and takes a lot. The script seems to think that it's somewhat in on the joke, but it very much is not. Claptrap suffers not at all. The worst thing that happens to him is that he gets sucked onto a magnet. Never is he punted around or made to face consequences for his narcissistic and boorish behavior. You start to sympathize with Handsome Jack wiping out his entire product line. As well, his harem joke takes the crown for the most tone-deaf and horrible joke in the entire game, possibly the entire series.
Oh, more ladies on Admiral Claptrap's bugship. Everyone's looking at Claptrap.
This sexist and lazy joke is so limp that it's almost not even offensive. The fact that he's standing in the same room as the core cast is simply unacceptable. How did Lilith allow this? Kill this man! On the topic of Lilith, she hasn't been worsened as much as she's simply been hollowed out. While the game ostensibly wants her to explore the difficulties of being a leader, she never really seems to have to make a choice. Almost all her reactions are forced, if not by circumstance, then by the transparent needs of the script. She forgets how to defend her life and even how her own powers work within the first chapter, and she spends the rest of the game telling you to do things that you are already going to do. Lilith does do a lot of characterization near the start of the game, but unfortunately, due to the fact that the game is very, very long, she spends the majority of the game sitting around in Sanctuary not doing a whole hell of a lot. Then, later, she just sort of hangs out on Sanctuary and occasionally chimes in when another important NPC is talking. Though she contributes almost nothing to the story, she's awarded an enormous presence within it. At the very end, she sacrifices her life to punch the moon, which it's unclear what that did or how it worked, but it's clear that it helped, and it's doubly clear that the story really wanted you to care that she's dead now. I will credit Lilith for giving me the largest laugh in the entire duration of Borderlands 3, when the credits started to play "This Girl is on Fire" right after she punched the moon.
I can't see the monitor.
I just wish the joke had been intentional, and not the equivalent of the ending of Crypt World. Lilith's character might have been savable had it not been for her recurring role as a stopgap to the player's progress. Talk to Lilith has been a meme within the community for a while now, but Lilith does legitimately become the harbinger of one of the larger pain points of Borderlands 3. Having to change gears, go back to Sanctuary 3, and lay down your controller while you go refill your drink. In Borderlands 2, the hands-down worst mission in the story is Toil and Trouble, where the story derails temporarily to go make you fight bandits that you don't care about in Sawtooth Cauldron. There was no reason to return to the area afterwards, especially since they nerfed the Evil Smasher, and the story basically invents a reason to go there. It easily could have been skipped. In Borderlands 3, skippable missions that pad out runtime feel like they compromise most of the plot. It's not enough to just board Sanctuary 3, you also have to run over a bunch of skags to get biofuel. Clayton needs you to go run around the swamp to kill his old colleague turned traitor, and you have to use this special gun that he just gave you. The Calypsos have sentry guns, so you have to go to Tannis' lab to give her a thing in order to remove them. Some bosses even have long stages where they're completely immune to all forms of damage, and you have to simply watch as they do their cool attack. A lot of these breaks are a symptom of the vault keys all having been split up into fragments, but collecting these fragments always seems arbitrary. It would have been much better for the pacing if the vault key was already in one piece and was constantly being snatched away from us by the Calypsos or Malawan or whoever. Worse than that, the story constantly pumps the brakes with long, unskippable sequences. While the game eventually did end up adding a cutscene skip feature, this feature is sort of a solution to a problem it shouldn't have. What? What?
I don't know why it canceled out.
Yeah, that was a pretty important cutscene. Why did it stop? What the fuck?
Yeah, why did In Borderlands 2, most of the cutscenes are very punchy and quick. They don't last more than a few minutes. Whereas in Borderlands 3, they can be overlong, weirdly paced out. There wouldn't need to be a cutscene skip if these cutscenes didn't interrupt gameplay, and they didn't convey information so inefficiently. Some of these are in 2, granted, but they're much more evenly spaced, and some of the ones that feel unskippable can just be walked around. The game moved largely at the player's pace and was rarely weighed down. Borderlands 2 achieves both replayability and consistent quality by moving at breakneck speed. Almost none of the main quests in 2 feel like wasted motion, even the ones in the mid-game that are similarly done off a checklist like the vault key fragments. The parts where Borderlands 2 is hard to bear are not the missteps. Those tend to move by quickly enough that there's not even enough time to ruminate before you're on to the next thing. But when the story's tires spin in the mud, and it forces you to wonder why you're wasting your time setting varkids on fire or running up a tower to get explosives. If Borderlands 3 didn't spend so much time tied up in mandatory areas and overlong cutscenes, not only would its strengths be more strong, but its weaknesses would be less pronounced. The player is given altogether too much time to ruminate on joke characters and game settings that should be nothing more than a blur in the rearview mirror. I can remember a staggering amount of Borderlands 2 simply because I've replayed it so much. I remember Borderlands 3 because I was given ample time to study it from each angle before moving on. The end result of all this waste of time is a game that simultaneously feels rushed and undercooked, loose ideas of a story that are connected through long sections of characters flapping their jaws at you. There are, however, moments that the game almost breaks free of the mud that it is constantly stuck in, moments that feel like an oasis in an endless blank void. Part 4. Potential. I have been hard on this game so far, so I want to praise a moment where it genuinely shines. Blindsided during a supposed meeting with Aurelia Hammerlock, Troy Calypso phase locks the player, begins talking about how he's becoming increasingly uncomfortable with living under his sister's thumb. Just as the monologuing starts to feel to be a bit too much, he's shot in the chest by Wainwright Jacobs. This doesn't kill him, but it does irritate him, causing him to lose focus on the player to chase after Wainwright. The player then jets through the mansion to get what they came for, all the while listening to a fun back and forth between Wainwright and Troy. This mission works so well because it establishes stakes. It uses some time to establish aspects of Troy's character, but it doesn't let it linger too long before establishing that other characters are present, and still threats. There's no rule that says they can't fight back. It establishes why the player character doesn't intervene in the fight, and the villain speaks directly to the player, and what could be dry exposition is a little bit tinged by the fact that it seems like Troy is genuinely venting to you. As well, the cutscene transitions directly into gameplay, giving your pressing forward some urgency as an altogether normal man like Wainwright runs away from Troy, who at this point has demonstrated godlike power. Alongside all that, it establishes that Troy can not just be wounded, but enraged. He's more threatening in this section than he is anywhere else due to the fact that it's clear that he's absolutely seeing red through his strong vocal performance and the merciless taunting of Wainwright. Oh wait, they got killed in their beds.
Boy, aren't you the one who has to suck at your sister's teeth for sustenance? Die in a gutter!
He's actually angry! He's getting fucked with! They're vulnerable! This is... Why can't it stay this way? What makes Handsome Jack a great villain in the previous installment isn't just that he's quippy and funny, rather it's his enormous range of character. While franchise fans might remember him boasting about carving out a man's eyes with a spoon or talking about a horse made of diamonds, the moments where Handsome Jack is the most effective as a villain are the moments where he's vulnerable. He's set up and knocked down.
So, the Vault Hunter met the slabs. What a lovely opportunity to kill 2 bandits with 1 mortar assault. Hey! Nobody destroys my beacons! On the march, bandits!
This sequence stands out as one of the few times when you genuinely seem to be able to get on the Calypso's nerves. So often, the Calypsos teleport in without any warning, except for the predictable factor of them almost always coming in after a vault is emptied.
Hey, before we go out there, guys.
Are there any main characters that you guys really like?
Do you guys think that we should wait a little while, just so we're not available to help with anything that might be happening outside of the vault portal?
It feels pointless to be afraid of them because their plans don't really have any guile. It's unclear why they don't just teleport bandits onto Sanctuary 3 until the entire team is dead. Here, Troy does legitimately ambush you, but has also ambushed himself due to his big mouth. As well, he uses his powers cleverly, and the shifting dynamic between the twins, underutilized as it is, begins to feel more palpable here. This mission feels like it goes by fast because it establishes stakes that give the player inertia. It's not the player stuck in a room shooting gorillas while a computer makes monkey sex noises. Instead, it has the feeling of clearing the way to your objective and to Wainwright before Troy can catch him and kill him. If more of the cutscenes and sequences in Borderlands 3 were like this, the time it spent on them would be much more forgivable. And this isn't the game's only strong point. It does have a lot of good to offer when it steps out of the shadow of previous games and tries something new. Carnivora is a genuinely fun section where Tannis is being dangled over a pit while you hack your way through a bandit camp. All the while you're taunted by Penn and Teller, who are here for some reason.
This guy that's playing Pain sounds like, what's the magician duo?
But in the moment, it works perfectly. Even the slightly drawn-out boss fight using the normally clumsy vehicle combat is acceptable because it's against a giant skull tank. Later, Typhon DeLeon's fantastic voice work and infectious enthusiasm make most of his segment a blast, though the story does trip over the re-edition of the humorless joke of someone named Traunt. Typhon is more playful and fun than most of the other quest givers, and seems to genuinely admire everything you've done. His love for vault hunting is somewhat a love for the core of the series, and it's nice to see it represented so wholesomely here. While his connection with his children isn't explored to the level I think would be greatly cathartic, just because they don't have the time at this point in the story, him having to grapple with allying with someone who moments ago pulled the trigger on his only son is an interesting and new territory for a game that ordinarily concerns itself with blowing the heads off bandits with silly names. These moments of strength, though, are in contrast to its moments of weakness. And all problems in Borderlands 3 are downstream of one thing. The game simply does not know when something is better left on the cutting room floor. Part 5. Please just stop talking. If Borderlands 3 simply knew when to be quiet, the game would be shorter, punchier, and altogether better. Jokes go on for far too long, jokes never stop coming, and nobody ever takes a moment to breathe. Borderlands 2 was also pretty jam-packed with dialogue, but most of it wasn't comedic, at least not as much as 3 manages. Borderlands 3, by comparison, seems to think that if it doesn't try to make a joke every 5 seconds, you'll lose interest and go play Destiny 2 instead. The roster is jam-packed with joke-spewing characters. Claptrap, Reese, Fawn, Balex. The only straight man character for them to bounce off of is Lilith, who isn't always there to segment out the non-stop deluge of tired jokes that just won't die. And it's not as if there were no characters that could have picked up her slack. Mordecai, suspiciously absent from the story by and large, would have slotted nicely into this role, but apparently he didn't care about making Pandora a better place and carrying on the legacy of his friend Roland, and instead went back to his day job of odd mercenary work. As well, the sheer amount of comic relief characters and sequences that Lilith must buttress diminishes further from her character as she's routinely forced to be the baseboard that all these jokes have to bounce off, leaving her feeling wooden and mirthless. It would be pointless to harp on any individual jokes. Plenty of games that function well have comedic misfires, and many times they miss more than they hit. Instead, the flow of these jokes is the ultimate death knell for the enjoyability of the story. So oversaturated is the game with comedy that the story is completely drowned out by constant attempts at sarcastic humor that make you regard the story as secondary. If the main cast of the game barely seems to care about the story, if the villains barely take themselves seriously, and if even your player character seems to regard the whole affair as just an avenue towards violence and loot with the rest as a joke, why should the player care? Characters seem to alternate from a deluge of jokes into a deluge of exposition. Things that don't need to be explained are explained, and things that already have been explained are explained again, just in case you weren't paying attention. It's difficult to engage with returning and new characters when they constantly take breaks from what should be endearing character actions to start yakking on the Echo communicator about things you absolutely do not need to hear, but have to wait to be over before you can progress. The best example of this is Clay, a new character and part of one of the best chapters of the game. Initially when you meet him, he's fun and honestly a good fit for the jolly murderer vibe of the Borderlands cast. Clay begins to rapidly grate on the player, however, when they have to sit through him explaining every detail about the town of Reliance, about his bounty hunting companions, about Aurelia Hammerlock, information that is learned and discarded like you're studying for a test. Oh, regale me. I think it would have been nicer not to know that. Hard to like Clay by the end simply because, as a wholly new character without any previously existing goodwill, most of what he's done has been to dump information at your feet like an abandoned child at the firehouse. And as the information gets increasingly multitudinous and less relevant, taking in said information begins to feel like a similar act of pity. The gratuity is present somewhat in the gameplay as well, and while that may seem at first like a good thing, it really isn't. The screen is constantly oversaturated with yelping bandits, flashing lights, damage numbers, abilities going off, and altogether just chaos that feels more like watching a MOBA fight than it is firing a gun. Most of these problems aren't present in the early game, but as the game winds on, the fights get more and more loud and unintelligible, with elemental explosions, gunfire from allies and enemies, sarcastic quips from bandits, screaming from being lit on fire. All the while dialogue is floating over top like oil on water.
That's it!
The game's reputation for excess renders it unpleasant to play at high levels, where the overexposure begins to feel less like a shooting game and more like being stuck inside a 24/7 slot machine. This overwhelming excess is present from the start to the very end of the story, and judging by the franchise's reputation, it might follow it past the end. Part 6. Looking forward. Borderlands 3 promised to be bigger and better, and to its staggering detriment, it doesn't seem to see a meaningful difference between the two. Borderlands is a franchise that prides itself on being silly, on being over-the-top, deeply unserious. This is a curse more than it is a gift. The craft that goes into making the previous games feel like a lunatic hayride of oddball characters and endless loot, it's a tightrope balance that cannot be answered with making the rope longer. The franchise has a deep vein of rot in it that prevents it from moving forward, that it always must be bigger, better, more explosive, more loud. And I hope that, at this point, it's obvious that the problems that were present in Borderlands 3 that sunk it weren't mediocre character designs, or reused art assets, or cringy weapon names. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of its reputation as a franchise. I would want to satisfy expectations by making an enormous game. Borderlands is funny, so make sure the characters are always spouting jokes. Borderlands has legendary, so make sure that there are 3 instead of 1. Borderlands is replayable, so make sure that there are enormous missions and enormous maps, jam-packed with even more jokes and even more weapons. And I guess there needs to be a story, so drizzle it in between the jokes if it can fit. Borderlands is a victim of its own reputation, and if the next game is going to be anything more than a retread of the mistakes that it made in Borderlands 3, it needs to learn some lessons. And if I could sneak anything into the development ethos this late into Borderlands 4, it would be this sentiment. Less is more. Thank you very much for watching. Special thank you to my close personal friends who played through this game with me and helped me capture some footage for it, and are sort of the inspiration for this whole video, as while I was replaying it with other people, I found myself defending it, which confused me because I kind of internalized that this game is not very good. I'd like to make more videos like this in the future. I don't know exactly what they'll be about, but I think that they'll probably be a little more constructive than this one. This one was a little bit more experimental. I think in the future I'll probably be covering something slightly more highbrow than something with Brandy Pitchford's creative fingerprints on it. If piqued your interest at all over the course of this video, I'd encourage you to like, comment, subscribe, do the things you ordinarily do to push a video through the horrible maze of an algorithm that our corporate overlords have created for us. Just because you don't like the game doesn't mean you don't have to play.